my talk. So I'll be talking about the role of religion in the Ottoman Empire and the relationship between the Ottoman state and religion throughout its history. One thing it's important to understand, the Ottoman Empire is one of the major Islamic empires that consolidate in the 16th century between North Africa and Southeast Asia. So you have the Ottoman Empire in North Africa and Middle East. Then you have the Safavid Empire in Iran, more or less, roughly in Iran. And then the Mughal Empire, which rules in what will become India. And all these three empires, they more or less consolidate their territories in the 16th and more or less the 17th century. And as the other empires, the legitimacy of the Ottoman Empire was related to its political guarantee of an Islamic moral and social order. That was the main claim of legitimacy of the Ottoman Empire. That it would uphold a social order that would be coherent with Islamic morality. And of course, the Ottomans, they inherit a relationship between the state and religion from other Muslim empires that preceded them since the beginning, since the first Muslim Arab empire that organized in the 7th and 8th century. And in these empires, of course, Islam was the main moral framework for society, but it would apply specifically to the Muslims. And the non-Muslims, I mean, some non-Muslims could live in a Muslim society or under these Islamic empires, specifically the non-Muslims that would be recognized as Ahl al-Kitab, or people of the book, or that means non-Muslims who had a prophet and a sacred book. Jews, of course, Christians, Zoroastrians were incorporated into this idea. And as the Muslim empires would expand, and they would be faced with other non-Muslim populations, a few adaptations were made. For instance, of course, the Buddhists was easy. You had Buddha and you had the Buddhist texts, so that's quite easy. But then you had the Hindus, and that was not easy, because of course, technically speaking, the Hindus would be classified as polytheists, and polytheists had no place in a Muslim society or under a Muslim empire. But of course, the Hindus were too numerous to be persecuted, and so it was not feasible. So a few adaptations were created. In some texts, they say that Krishna was a prophet and the Bhagavad Gita is the holy book. Others say the Manu, Hindu king, was a prophet, and the laws of Manu would be the equivalent of the holy book. But anyway, there were accommodations to this notion of the Ahl al-Kitab, of the non-Muslims that could legally exist in a Muslim society. And these non-Muslims, of course, they were not equal to the Muslims. There was no notion of equality in any sense. They were politically and morally inferior. And that's clear, and juridically inferior, of course. But on the other hand, they had a high degree of autonomy. They could, of course, practice their religion and have their own religious law regulating their lives, their private lives. Muslim law would only intervene in the relationship between a non-Muslim and a Muslim, and when the non-Muslims would request a Muslim court to intervene into their affairs. But issues of marriage, inheritance, personal law, and all other issues were regulated by their own courts. That means ecclesiastical courts for the Christians, rabbinical court for Jews. The Zoroastrians would have their own courts. In India, of course, the Hindu holy man would regulate the law for the Hindus and so on and so forth. And the non-Muslims, they had to pay a tax, the jizya, that was only levied on them, which they would pay in return for protection from the Muslim state. So the state would protect them from external enemies and internal enemies. That means if a non-Muslim population were attacked by a mob, the state could intervene or should intervene to stop the killings or stop the violence against the non-Muslim. And those who paid the jizya were called dhimmi, the protected people. They would be under the direct protection of the political power. That was their status in the Muslim society. And that arrangement more or less organized the issue of religious plurality in Muslim societies throughout Muslim history until the 19th century. And the dhimma is a very tricky issue for historians and for people who study the Muslim societies, because you have two major ideological approaches to the dhimma, which I call the golden legend and the black legend. The black legend, which usually comes from a group of Israeli-based scholars, not necessarily historians. The main scholar is a woman called Bati Yor. She's not a professional historian, but she wrote a series of books on the dhimma and on the status of non-Muslims under Muslims empire. And basically, she selects all the cases of violence, of oppression, of discriminations against the dhimmi, and she paints a portrait that's very bleak. The idea that the non-Muslims were systematically persecuted under Muslim rule, they would be denied any kind of peace or rights. They basically, their position would be structurally similar to the position of Jews in Christian Europe. That more or less what you can imagine. Barely tolerated and subject to all kind of arbitrary violence. That's what I call the black legend. And then you have the golden legend, which is a kind of scholarship that is very apologetic of Islam and, of course, Muslim social order, which says that, on the contrary, everything was fantastically fine. No, the dhimmis has a wonderful life, everything was beautiful, everybody loved each other, and they lived together forever, ever, ever, until the evil colonial Europeans arrived. Of course, both visions are quite inaccurate from the point of view of history or historical sources, and I guess both visions would be a scandal for people who lived under the dhimma, both the Muslims and the non-Muslims, because they suppose a kind of relationship that is connected to modern ideas of coexistence. The idea that either you have absolute rights or you denied of any kind of possible existence. To get a nice picture, I always refer to a Muslim traveler of the 13th century, Ibn Jubayr. Ibn Jubayr traveled around the Middle East, and he happened to cross the Crusade-dominated territories in Syria. And the Crusades, as actually most Muslim kingdoms that had, most Christian kingdoms that had Muslim populations, they used a system very similar to the dhimma. The Muslims, they would be subjected to several kind of hierarchical inequalities, and they would be directly related to the political power. They were protected. So in Christian Spain or Portugal, the Muslims, they would be directly related to the king, who would protect them, but also would tax them, and they would work for him. Otherwise, they would be subjected to all kind of arbitrariness. And Ibn Jubayr writes his memories. In his memories, the following sentence. He says, well, what I experienced under the territory of the Salibin, the Crusaders, is similar to the kind of experience that the non-Muslims have under Muslim rule. I was restricted in many senses, but I could survive. And reading Ibn Jubayr, you get a very interesting sense of what the Dhimma was. It was not pleasant, it was not easy, but on the other hand, was a much broader formula for coexistence than you could find elsewhere. For instance, in Christian Europe, where you could not be Muslim, and if you, the only non-Muslim, non-Christian minority that was tolerated were the Jews, but tolerated in a very thin layer of tolerance, because of course the Jews were subjected to all kinds of violence and violent discrimination throughout Christian history. But it's interesting also to read the conclusion that Ibn Jubayr gets. I mean, he experienced the same situation as the Dhimmi. He sees that this is not pleasant, this is not easy to be a Dhimmi, but he concludes that because of that, the non-Muslims should be really put under more restricted terms of coexistence. Of course, it shocks our modern sensibility. He would say, well, maybe it's not nice what we do. No, he says, it's very good that we have that, and it's better that we enforce that to prevent them to enforce this kind of rule on us. Also, that's very interesting to understand that in the pre-18th century mind, there was no problem with hierarchical distinctions within society. Actually, the issue would be who would be on the top and who would be on the bottom.